Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Monday, September 29th, 2025. We're going to be going over the House elections for 2026, which are looking very complicated with the redistricting wars, but we'll be getting you through all of that as we go across the entire country with our map here and explaining everything from retirements to the likely outcomes for states and more. Election Time News, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, follow the Substack for articles on elections and dynamics, and follow the Threads, Instagram, and X to stay up to date on news and updated predictions regularly. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So now on to the video here, we have the super safe map, and we're going to be looking at the retirements to start things off. There are a few super safe districts that I intentionally did not include here, and that's just because I wanted to go over... There it is. My cursor disappeared for a second. Just wanted to go over a few super safe districts where there are a few retirements. Start things off in... I'm just going to turn on the region tooltips real quick just so I can make sure I get these right. In Alabama's 1st congressional district, there's a Republican. Barry Moore is retiring to run for the U.S. Senate. In Georgia, we have two districts, both the 1st and 10th. We have retirements for Buddy Carter and Mike Collins, respectively, both to run against each other for the Senate against Ossoff. In South Carolina, the 1st district, that's not safe. That's Nancy Mace. South Carolina's 5th district, Ralph Norman is retiring to run for governor of South Carolina. Up in Kentucky, we have the 6th district, and that is Andy Barr retiring to run for U.S. Senate. In Iowa, up here in the 4th congressional district, we have Randy Feenstra retiring to run for governor of Iowa, and then South Dakota's statewide Dusty Johnson is retiring to run for governor of South Dakota. So there actually are no safe Democratic districts where there are any retirements happening across the country. Just something interesting of note there. So we end up with to start off as 146 to 118, and this is both with Texas and California having redistricted. What we're going to be looking at next is the midst of the Redistricting War. I have an entire page dedicated to it now, and that is also publicly available. So I'm going to be breaking it down, each and every state that has had some talks of the overall potential redistricting, and so this is in order of chance to redistrict. Number 1 is Utah, 100% chance to redistrict. This is forced, as it is shown here as well. Utah, the same, or Ohio, the same thing. The reason that it is not 100% for Ohio, though, is because it's not 100% sure if Republicans will actually end up gaining any seats from it. But Utah, it is absolutely certain that Democrats will gain some seat advantage from it, considering how strong of a margin it was here, especially, looking at how, especially after 2020. In 2018, Democrats managed to flip a seat in Utah by a quarter point, and then it flipped back in 2020 by just over 1 point. But then 2022, the maps were intentionally redrawn to split up the Democrats in Salt Lake City, and they have not come anywhere close. I believe the closest was the 23-point margin, 23.8% in 2024 is literally the closest that they've gotten so far. And statewide, 63.1 to 32.2 is a pretty interesting margin, considering 59 to 37 was on the presidential level. So all of those basically are above the total margin for president, which means that obviously you end up with the incumbency bonus and almost perfectly splitting it up in 4. So the Utah Supreme Court justified it, said it was not legal. It's actually complicated because back in 2018, Utahns voted for a new independent redistricting commission, yet the legislature decided to impose a map that was not proposed by the legislature and signed it. And that is what the Supreme Court officially decided, the Utah Supreme Court. The nationwide Supreme Court has said multiple times that they do not hear cases regarding state gerrymandering. But they actually struck down the map because it was not proposed by the Independent Redistricting Commission that was proposed and passed a referendum in 2018. That is the official decision. So then, semantics aside, either way, this map is going to change, and most likely it will go to the benefit of Democrats, who will likely be able to pull off one seat. In Texas, 98.1% chance, almost a 100% chance, because there is, in theory, a chance that it could be struck down with these legal challenges. Yet, as of right now, it is 98.1% chance. That's 4.9 seats with a general gain. That's just multiplying 5 times the chance. So that's 4.9 seats. California up for vote, very high chance that it will, in fact, pass. It's going to have 4.47 seats, which means that the Democrats are back in the positive. But then you end up with Ohio, which is mandated redraw. About an 87% chance that the Democrats are going to lose a seat here is essentially the... I did see a proposed map that actually only had 2 seats for Democrats, or maybe there was 3. But either way, that would take out Sykes and Captor's seats. As right now on this map, we're going off of the expectation that actually it would not change. Missouri, it passed, but it's likely to be on the ballot, as it did already, I believe, almost gain enough signatures to be going onto the ballot, and generally, Missouri is not a fan of, is very liberal on their ballot measures. So they're probably going to reject that measure, but that is still going to be enough that as of right now, we are going to be, since it did pass the legislature, we're going to be going off of that assumption there. Florida, idea proposed but has not gone to the floor, but that is just enough that still, even with that chance of a less than 50% chance, since it's less than 50%, we will be going off the assumption that it does not happen. Even then, it still ends up being a 1.976 seat gain for the Republicans on average. Indiana, maps proposed but has not gone to the floor. That's going to be a 48% chance of victory. Wisconsin, this case is actually being heard in the state Supreme Court. That will likely end up benefiting Democrats 1 seat, 36.7% chance there. Illinois, idea proposed, but no official map proposal. There have been a few that actually did gain 1 seat for the Democrats. And actually, there were a few maps that were proposed back in 2021 for the current redistricting cycle that actually held up for the 2024 election results, which is surprising considering how little Kamala Harris won the state by. That could potentially end up getting passed, but not relatively high. And then all of these other ones are below 2.5%. They should generally not have any high regard held. Anything less than 5% is going to be in that red category. Green is almost certain. And then you have yellow, which is take a grain of salt. Red is almost certain to not happen. Map proposed in North Carolina. There was one that got rid of Davis's district up here, but it is likely to not pass because of the Supreme Court, and it's already so gerrymandered as it is. Oregon, idea proposed, but no official map proposal, 1.5%. Kansas, a map was proposed, but they have a Democratic Supreme Court. And then Maryland, Alabama, and New York. The ideas were rejected by the governors, and I believe in New York also there are restrictions as to how it can be redistricted and such that will likely have problems running into that. So 3.859 net seats gained. That's 3.86 seats for the Republicans. On average, if you run through all the chances that happened, that's not honestly all that many, but it might just be enough to be able to hold on to the House, considering how close it is going to be. But if all of them went through, the Republicans would gain 7 seats. So that's been interesting. They definitely had more possibilities, but a few are definitely being lost down here with very low chances, especially North Carolina being R+2. I believe they were able to squeeze out another one here in the outer, I believe that's Raleigh area. That might be Raleigh. I don't remember the cities here. Wake County's up here. So the one with the city in Wake County and the Research Triangle was the main one. They were potentially also able to draw out. So now with that, we can get onto the map. So what we have here are some of the more safe districts. And so what we're going to be getting at is starting off on the This is the super safe map. We can basically guarantee that these districts that are colored will go one way or the other for the candidates unless something drastic happens. And this is because they either had a very high vote. In Texas and California, it's not as certain, but in all the other ones, they voted for 70% or more for the candidate. Oh, also, I forgot about Wisconsin. In Wisconsin's 7th district, they're retiring to run for governor. That announcement was last week. So to start things off let's go over to the West Coast. We have a few that are relatively safe here. We have Washington 6th. That was 13.6. It's likely going to end up being another safe district. And then moving on, just keep on moving throughout the rest of the states here. Pretty much these West Coast, Oregon, are likely going to be safe. You get into some of these areas in California. Now, these are going to be a bit interesting because we're not exactly sure how they're going to go one way or the other, but most likely they're going to end up being a bit less competitive. They were typically drawn so that's Missouri. I'm going to pull up the California one really quickly. And so we're not very likely to end up actually, there it is. I just got it up. Let me pull it up here. If we look at the California map, you can see there's quite a few down here, very, very slim margins here. You actually have the 40th district down in the south over here. That's right here. That is a bit red, but in a conservative environment, that's going to be the Trump versus Harris margin, and that would likely end up being a bit red or a bit blue on the environment expected in 2026. But there's quite a few somewhat competitive margins down here. That's because of the national environment that's expected to be strong for Democrats. So it's almost certainly going to be safe right there. There's a few slim ones in here, except for the one that Gray is in. So all of these ones in here are likely going to be safer, at least likely. And so for the rest of that, not necessarily going to be very competitive. We might end up having a potential safe margin for Horsford, but most likely not down here. Republicans going to end up having a safe margin in the northern part of the state. That's almost certain. Utah, that's redistricted. That's going to be a bit complicated. 13.8 for Crank. Now, the thing about House districts is they do shift a lot, and Colorado is continuing to trend to the left, so that's going to be a complicated one, probably going to be a bit less than safe. In Arizona, we have no real other safe districts. 20 for Biggs district, that might end up being safe. As of right now, that's likely. Hamadeh probably going to end up being less than a safe margin, though. That's actually a very impressive 94-point margin, but that area has been somewhat close, but, not necessarily anything crazy right now. Texas is essentially almost all up in the air. This is going to be interesting because there's actually a Republican and a Democratic incumbent there, and there's no incumbent over on this side. That's just due to how it was redistricted. But almost certainly those are all going to end up going red anyway. This is essentially a safe district in Louisiana. This is a very likely district in Alabama. That's by 9.2 in a bad year. That's going to end up going safe. Same thing there. If you go into Florida, what we're looking at is going to be Scotto by 12.6. It's almost certain to go for him there. We have the one in southern Miami is essentially safe. Because of how it's trending, you might end up having Frankel end up being the only one that's actually going to be safe there this time. Narrow gain. Castor by probably just over 10. Then you go these next door neighbors, almost certainly going to stay safe. Lee, that's going to be with an asterisk. Same thing for Bean, because that's not necessarily heavily Cuban or Latino areas there, and that's mostly what's been driving most of that to the right. Wilson's almost certainly going to hold on by a strong amount, but if you look at 2018, though, on the other hand, the district that Mace is currently in actually did go blue in 2018. They did redraw it a bit, so it had a bit more of these red areas, but it's still going to be somewhat interesting to potentially see it get a bit closer, maybe just under 10, because she is, of course, retiring, not going to be in that district. Most of these are probably going to end up being a safe margin across North Carolina. You could end up having a few that are probably going to be just under 10. Potentially Edwards, not necessarily a very strong incumbent. Harris is probably going to be over 10, though. This is going to be the suburbs, which are going to flip very hard against Trump, most likely, as they did in 2018. So that's going to be somewhat interesting to see. These suburban areas may end up being very, very close, potentially end up getting this closer down to just around 10, but they're not going to flip for Democrats. That's not necessarily very plausible. Go up into Virginia. The 5th district here is probably going to end up being just barely safe, but not much else. The 12.8 for Whitman is probably going to end up being below 10 at the end of the day. Pennsylvania basically just going to end up having the southeastern part of the state continue to be trending that way. Houlihan only won by 12.5. That's probably going to end up being a relatively safer margin. Deluzio in a very strong year is going to end up being by over 10. And Lee is definitely going to be over 10, considering the Democrats are expected to win the popular vote by a considerable amount. Going to New Jersey, Conway and Norcross are probably going to end up winning by safe margins here. That's going to be an upgrade for Conway, obviously. Gottheimer is going to do better. Cheryl obviously has retired. She's probably going to end up being governor of New Jersey in just a few months. But it was a relatively lackluster performer as far as things go, but it was also a very right trending district. I believe Trump won this district by about a point, so that's something to note as well. Van Drew almost certainly to win re-election, even though back this district actually did go blue in 2018. It is a bit more friendly towards Republicans now. If we go up into New York, we have a few interesting districts here. Almost all of the area in New York City is already dealt with, but now we also have Ryan that's going to be the 18th district, almost certain to go that way. Mannion flipped the district. That's going to end up going safe as well. And then you go to Connecticut. All of these are going to end up being safe blue, except for this district right here, which could be potentially competitive. But Hayes was actually expected to be very competitive, only won by 0.79 in 2022. Was watched, expected to be very, very close. But even in a strong red year, actually ended up going by 7 points. So I'd actually argue this could potentially end up being a strong, safe district for Democrats. It's not going to be very competitive. The Republicans probably aren't going to put that much money into it. Both districts in Rhode Island are going to be safe. All of the districts in Massachusetts are going to be safe. It's actually hard to draw a map. That Keating is going to win by a relatively strong margin. I would argue that Goodlander might be able to pull off a win by over 10, just like she did in 20. It's actually Custer. She was actually a new candidate, won by 6, probably going to win by over 10. Moving over a bit more towards the west, completely unsure about what's going on here, but Turner is likely going to win by over 10 no matter what. If things don't change much, Carey might be going in for under 10. Same thing for Miller. But if the map is changed a bit more favorable towards Republicans, then that's not going to be the case. Landsman would, in fact, win by more than 10 based on how things are looking right now for the national environment. Going over to Michigan, with Schulten is going to end up winning by more than 10 in this scenario, as well as Stevens did retire, obviously, to run for the Senate there. She's not doing too well, though. John James retiring as well. That's going to be a bit closer of a district. If we go into Wisconsin, the next door neighbor we have to look at is going to be wide seat by 14.7. That's potentially going to be a bit under. Same thing with Stale, only by 10.2. He won by 8.9 in 2022. Van Orden is definitely going to be the seat to watch. Actually dropped by a point, even though the statewide vote did shift actually a lot more towards Democrats, interestingly enough, than 2022, which is something interesting of note. Just how much it shifted towards Democrats in 2024. Then we go into Minnesota. What we're going to be looking at is Stauber and Finstead most likely able to hold on to their seats, not necessarily very competitive anywhere. Morrison almost certain, and that's going to be Angie Craig's seat. She's retired to run for Senate, but most likely going to be able to hold on to stay blue anyways. Looking over here, Hinson did, of course, retire as well. That could potentially end up being under 10. Not necessarily going to be competitive, though. Moving over to Illinois, almost all of these are going to be safe blue, more or less. They're intentionally drawn that way. Not going to be very competitive. Indiana, of course, with the caveat that they may end up redistricting. If they don't, Mervyn probably going to end up winning that by a good bit. Tennessee, that district's going to end up being red. That is the 5th district, probably by over 10. Same thing in Arkansas while we're over there. Missouri, this is the current map, but if you look at this map, you can see that kind of have to outlay it on there. That's kind of how it ended up going, but we're going to end up having only 2 strong districts. Most likely, most of these are going to end up being red. by the end of the day, but there's potential that this R plus 20 or this R plus 22 district or this R plus 20 district could end up getting a bit under 10. Not entirely certain, but as of right now, until we get more information, all of those are likely going to go red. Next door in Kansas, that's 18. That's 19-point margin. Not likely to get much closer. Flood probably going to win by around 18 points or so at the end of the day there. Texas is a bit complicated, of course, with this new map. But this map is actually drawn assuming a lot for Hispanic trends and considering how they've turned against Trump, especially with his approval rating. If you look down here, especially with Texas in general, if you look at all, Texas is now the only state alongside North Carolina that went for Trump all 3 times. That now has a negative approval rating for him amongst 2024 voters, meaning that the same electorate that voted for him by almost 14 points disapproves of him by 1.3. And he is also very underwater with Hispanic voters by over 25%. So that's definitely going to end up potentially harming him here, depending on how they end up campaigning. This is going to be a white voter issue up here, but for the Hispanic voters, it's definitely possible that almost all of these are going to end up being somewhat likely or potentially less. We'll have to see how those polls end up going. Obviously, if we look into New Mexico, it's almost certain that these two are going to end up being safe at the very least. We'll have to see for the more southern, more competitive 2nd district. Boebert, not very likely to end up winning by a double-digit margin this time around. Hurd, not as much either. But that's going to likely end up being a safe district. Utah is going to be complicated. We'll have to see what the final map proposal looks like. Hamadeh is almost not very likely to end up winning by that much. We look at these districts over here, again, very complicated. Alaska is somewhat competitive. So there we finally got through all of the more safe districts. Here are the ones that are more competitive. Real quick, gonna download this because now we have the all right, there we go. So now we end up with the current map, the more competitive map. Oh, I forgot about Kansas Democratic District. Davids is going to end up winning by a considerable amount as well. It's not a competitive seat after all. That's not necessarily... It's actually not competitive. So here's the final relatively competitive map. So let's get, also missed Delaware. So apparently there's a few districts that I did actually end up missing here. That's going to be a safe district as well for the Democrats. That's not going to be very competitive, but it could be in a rough year for the Democrats, actually. That's a relatively blue district. So that's finally going to be the... Okay. All right, finally getting into the competitive districts. So to start in the Northeast and then fan outward. Here we have Jared Golden, a very strong candidate who will likely be able to hold on for another year, especially in a better year for the Democrats. He did flip the seat in 2018 to begin with by 1 percentage point. Then he actually had his closest margin yet this past year. He still ended up winning. He is running for re-election. He could potentially end up winning by somewhere between 2 to 5 points. Excuse me. We have Chris Pappas here, who is retiring to run for Senate. Likely going to end up being a likely seat anyways, just because there's not really many contestants. And look, in general here, though, the Democrats are likely to take the House next year in 2026, 65% chance of victory there. So that's just a quick outlook starting at things. That was 178, 177. So with 80 competitive seats. New York, we actually have quite a few somewhat competitive districts, starting off with Riley, likely to be able to hold on to their seat there. Lawler, who got convinced to not actually end up running for governor there, actually would have potentially been a bit favored against Hochul, but now is not going to end up actually having much competition there. We end up having these 2 seats on Staten Island. Swozey and Gillen, probably going to end up being likely and narrowly lean to likely in general. La Lota is probably going to end up being by under a safe margin. This has actually been a left-trending seat. Garbarino definitely going to end up still being a safe margin. That actually should be in that safe seat anyway, but that's still going to be a bit more competitive than usual. Keene has been a strong overperformer. I wouldn't be surprised if he narrowly holds on yet again in New Jersey's 7th district, especially considering how the southern part of the city is still trending. But Powell is probably going to end up being able to win by over 5 points this cycle. If you're looking at Pennsylvania, I wouldn't be surprised if all three of these actually end up flipping, just because of this going to be some working class support. But this has been left trending for quite some time. Most likely, this will be the cycle that Perry ends up losing. Even in 2018, he did end up winning by 2.5 points. But if you look at this area, Cumberland County is actually one of the few counties that trended to the left towards Kamala Harris from Joe Biden. You actually have the Harrisburg region over here, and then you have York as well. So this is a somewhat competitive district there. And you're having these two areas centered around Lehigh County and the Scranton area as well. Both of those flipped by about 1.5 points. Both of those are narrowly going to be Democratic favored until we get a bit more information out of there. We have the mayor of Scranton who's running against Brezhnev right now as well, so there's also a name there. But Fitzpatrick is a relatively well-liked name, so that's probably going to end up being a hold for the Republicans in the state of Pennsylvania. Going down into Maryland, this is basically a safe seat. 6.3 points, probably going to end up being by a safe margin at the end of the day, in the end of the night. Kiggins in Virginia, depends on how things end up trending, especially looking at the Virginia governorship race that later this year. That's probably going to end up giving us a lot of information on how this may end up going. But as of right now, still lightly favored for the Republicans, just because it's not looking like as strong of a year as 2018. Plus, this is also a bit Republican out here. But we're definitely going to have to look at returns in the Virginia Beach area over here this fall. Both of these districts are probably going to end up being likely margins for the Democrats. Probably just upgrade that a bit. Whitman's probably going to end up winning by just under 10. North Carolina's probably going to end up looking a bit orangey this cycle, just because of how it's drawn, but the Republicans are probably not going to have to compete too much. Probably going to be likely in the western part of the state with the small city over there. I forget exactly what it's named. Moore probably going to end up having difficulty with some suburban support, but probably going to end up being able to hold on after all. Rouser might end up being by over 10, not entirely sure though. Not same thing there, but depends on youth turnout for the Democrats. And then Davis probably going to end up holding on by probably over 2 points. He was originally going to run for Senate, but then once Roy Cooper entered, he dropped out and endorsed him, so he is going to stay in that seat. Mace's seat is probably going to end up being under 10 just because there's no incumbent there. Going down to Florida real quick before we then round up and go back north. We're going to go down at the Foot area here. We end up having probably a likely margin there, potentially a likely margin in Moskowitz seat, probably a slight upgrade by only about 1/10 of a point or so. Not going to be anything huge. Mills seat may end up getting a bit closer, depends on how support in this area goes. And then you end up with Bean potentially having some support there. That's going to be completely on white vote. And then Luna is going to win probably by closer to about 5 points than anything. A bit closer to her, definitely closer to her 2022 margin than anything. And finally, to round out the state, we end up having Lee is probably going to end up being by just under 10 points due to some black support there. Turnout is going to be the main game for the Democrats. Depends on how things go for it with the young black men vote. Almost and certainly going to be the decider down there. Kerry potentially going to win by about just under 10% as of right now. Miller potentially just over 10, depends on how the suburbs end up voting again. Captor probably going to end up securing her seat again. Relatively well-known, has been there for a long time. Used to be a different seat, obviously. Was over here back when it had a lot more well-known name. Has been there for a long time, all the way back since 1982. But her seat has changed a lot. It was basically, it used to be a Democratic vote dump seat, and now it is a potential contested seat. But even in 2022, she won by 13.3, now down to 0.63. So potentially very competitive seat there. Sykes probably going to end up winning by just over 5 in a strong year. Depends on how the governorship race and Senate race end up going in Ohio. Scholten probably going to end up winning by over 10. Zinga, though, probably going to end up winning by just under 10 as of right now. John James, that's potentially a potential seat pickup for the Democrats. Depends on how the industrial areas vote for Democrats there. Barrett likely to be held by under 5 by the environment, but McDonald Rivet being able to hold on to that seat. Just north, while neighbor to the South Hurdle did in fact that was actually Slotkin's seat, did in fact capitulate. That's going to entirely be both of them actually had incumbents retiring. That's going to be the main sign they'll be able to hold on in that district. That was accidental. Going into Wisconsin, what we have here is going to be Van Orden is definitely going to be a top target for Democrats, has continually been as of right now. Low approval rating from what I can tell. Wide, most likely going to be by just under 10. Stale, almost certainly going to be by under 10, just based on the national environment in general. And that finishes everything east of the Mississippi. Currently, so far, 200 to 197. Democrats will need to pick up a few, but they are definitely favored in California and the other two straight West Coast states. If we go into Iowa, Iowa's very susceptible to midterm shifts. Hinson's seat is likely going to be by just or under 10 or so, but Nunn and especially Miller Meeks are going to be very vulnerable here. I wouldn't be surprised if either of these flip by somewhat narrow margins, even though Trump did win it by a relatively large amount. Zooming into the state of Nebraska, Don Bacon's retiring here. This would definitely be a top pickup opportunity. In 2022 was 2.7, and then 2024 was 1.9, and that's with basically the exact same vote, which means it's definitely still continuing to be left trending. It's almost certainly going to be a pickup for the Democrats, potentially even by a lean margin. Going into Colorado, a very strong turnout, especially with white voters for the Democrats. Hurd definitely going to be by under 5. I wouldn't be surprised if even Boebert ends up being under 5, but as of right now, it's going to be over 5. And Evans is very, very closely holding that seat flipping that seat in 2024. Wouldn't be surprised if it ends up going under by quite a bit in 2026. New Mexico continually trending to the right, but most likely that the incumbency bonus may end up holding by over 5, like what we saw in 2022 was a narrow flip after redistricting, of course. 2020, Harrell flipped it after a narrow flip in 2018, where Harrell was trying to run for the seat and did end up flipping it. That was actually a rematch where it did actually end up working out for the proponent, but then they ended up redistricting it to split the largest city there. Harrell ran for it again in 2024. Actually has run for it every single time and continues to win, and now lost by 4.2 points. Potentially going to win by even more this time for the Democrats. Going off of Utah, most likely right now, we're just going to end up being as a safe and then a lean margin, but then base for the presidential for that ticket, but actually more likely it's going to end up looking something like this, because you're going to include that southern region over here. But most likely, based on the national environment, it's going to be a potential tilt seat for the Democrats, and there's probably going to be potentially a likely seat for the Republicans, but more likely to be a safe one instead. We'll have to see how the map proposals end up showing out. Crane is likely going to win by just under 9. Siscomani seat is definitely a top pickup opportunity for the Democrats, especially if you look at the Latino turnout vote, and especially with how things went with Grijalva. His daughter won that seat by almost like 45 points. That was definitely low turnout, but they definitely just show a lot for the Latino turnout in that area. Hamadeh definitely probably going to end up winning by under 10 points. Stanton going to win by most likely more than 10, that Eastern Phoenix area. And then Schweikert, I don't remember exactly if that's a retirement on the list. No, it is not. Okay, so that's likely going to end up being a tilt Republican seat as of right now. Going into Nevada, you end up having Titus and Lee, most likely both going to end up being likely margins. Titus on the higher end, Lee on the very low end there. That's also going to be southwestern Latino turnout sort of scenario. Going into California, again, this is another complicated one. Looking at the map, you can see that there's definitely a few seats over here that are going to be potentially lean. That's going to be Gray's district right there, almost untouched. And then you can see the 5th district is going to be a bit likely on there, and the 23rd district lean for the Republicans. 40th district is going to be lean as well, potentially down to tilt. We'll have to, again, see how these margins end up looking out. But it's probably going to be a mix of some of these numbers over the entire state. It will completely come down to how things go. Even the 22nd district, again, this was a very bad year for the Democrats in the state of California. So that plus a stronger margin nationwide is almost certain to end up boosting them. And that does, in fact, actually mean that they will end up winning the... Anything from 0 to 10 is that lightest color. So any of those are actually safe seats. So 28th is actually safe. Any of these are actually safe. So anything but in these regions is potentially going to end up being safe. Even some of these ones that were very strong for Trump are going to end up being somewhat competitive. But these are going to be, the 5th district probably going to be safe as well. And then this is between 10 and 20 points. So it could end up being safe or likely, not entirely sure. But this is almost certainly going to end up being the map or something along it in California. And that does get Democrats over 218 seats. Going into Montana, this is going to be a relatively competitive district, but Zinke managed to hold on yet again. That's going to be a strong showing for him. He actually was... he did 3.2 in 2022, improved on that margin in 2024, and considering the fact that here 7.7, yeah, it's not necessarily what it was. That's essentially 20. That's a 19-point margin in the state, and that's going to be an 18-point margin. So it barely shifted to the right, yet he ended up doing quite a bit better, which actually means that Downing did worse, yes. But he did end up improving there in the state. Most likely going to end up being another likely margin, probably going to be closer to about 6 points or so. And then I'll round it out, 4 districts left. We have Oregon's 5th district, which actually was expected to be very, very close, ended up being 2 3/4 for Bynum. And so that's going to end up being a lean margin there for another cycle, relatively on the lower end of the lean margin. Depends on how big this potential victory for the Democrats is going to be nationwide. Schreier likely to win by a safe margin, 8.2 in 2024, likely to be over 10. And then finally we end up with Perez, who is expected to lose, and it winning by 4. So potentially going to be relatively higher end of the likely scale. And then finally, 1 district left, you end up with Alaska's statewide, which did flip against Mary Peltola. She is likely not running there, so that almost certainly means it's going to be a likely to potentially safe margin for Begich to cruise to re-election in 2026, meaning that the final result will be 223 to 212, a 11 seat majority for the Democrats. Very, very slim, but still larger than what the Republicans are working with right now, and that would be a net flip, a net gain from 214 to 223 of only 9 seats. So that would only be a 9-seat net, which would be even smaller than the Republicans gained in 2022. So that is going to be a massive underperformance from what we had in 2018, which was a 41-seat gain for the Republicans. And even in 1994, that was a 54-seat gain for the Republicans. In 2010, 63 for the Republicans. The largest 2 were for the Republicans, the 3rd largest for Democrats. So obviously, that even though it's looking relatively good, just with everything going on from the redistricting wars to the general races themselves, things are not looking too strong. But again, there's 435 districts. And so if you have each and every one of them, there's a 1% chance that something happens. There's a somewhat good chance that at least one of them will have that thing happen. It's just general statistics, so there likely will be one upset. So you may end up having Zinke end up going down in Montana's 1st, or a Democrat ended up pulling through in the southern region of Texas with Hispanic turnout. Potentially all four of these end up getting ridiculously close or end up flipping. We're just going to have to wait and see how things go and wait for the polls to start coming in. So thank you all so much for watching. Today's video is a bit of a longer one, but I appreciate you sticking to the end there. And if you just came to look at the map, then, well, here you go, I guess, 223 to 212. Thank you all so much and have a fantastic rest of your day.